Welcome to our lecture on Chapter 12, Aggregate Supply and Demand for Week 8. Looking at aggregate supply and demand, we need to keep in mind that we're now in macroeconomics. So aggregate supply and aggregate demand are going to be significantly different from what we have learned in microeconomics concerning individual firm or industry supply and demand. Two things before we get into the mix. There are two different perspectives on how aggregate supply and demand function and which either aggregate supply or aggregate demand is emphasized in increasing long-run economic growth. So Say's law, which is followed by neoclassical economists, states that the supply creates its own demand. What they're saying is that there is an existing supply of goods and services, and consumers use the wages they made to create these goods and services to buy them up. So therefore, any existing supply will be purchased because consumers have wages from creating those goods and services. Therefore, a neoclassical economist tends to emphasize the need for adequate supply in an economy. Keynes, on the other hand, was someone who was studying economics during the Great Depression. So he felt that sometimes we can have insufficient aggregate demand. If we have insufficient aggregate demand, then we might have recessions, and if we have too much demand, we might have inflation. So Keynes said that demand creates its own supply. Therefore, there must be demand in place for goods and services for firms to feel the need to increase their production of goods and services, or if there's less demand, decrease their production of goods and services. So if a firm sees that there isn't a lot of demand for their product, they're not going to produce their product, and this can lead to situations where there is not sufficient demand and we would have a recession. From a Keynesian perspective, we'll probably need to use government intervention to stimulate aggregate demand or to curb some of the excess aggregate demand that's occurring, which is causing inflation. And so what is this aggregate demand and aggregate supply? Aggregate supply is simply the relationship between the total quantity that firms choose to produce and sell and the price level for output, holding the prices of inputs fixed. So ceteris paribus, the input price of the goods that go into producing whatever good or service is being produced are not changing. Therefore, there is a positive relationship between the total quantity firms will choose to produce and sell and the price level for output. At higher prices, firms are incentivized to produce more output. And this is going to be all of the production for the entire economy that you're studying. In aggregate supply models, we're going to look at two terms called potential and full employment GDP. So potential GDP is the maximum quantity that an economy can produce given its existing levels of labor, physical capital, technology, and the institutions that exist. So if we have a certain pool of individuals who can work and they have tools and work with certain technology, how much can they produce right now today? This would assume that there isn't any unemployment. This would assume that everyone is maximally efficient. This would assume that we're using the right tool for the right job and that we're harnessing technology to its maximum and that we don't have any sort of laws or policy situations which are causing us not to produce at our maximal output. So given our existing land, labor, capital, and technology, how much can we produce? And we would call that our potential or full employment GDP. So when the economy is producing at full employment GDP, this means there is no unemployment. All resources, whether they be physical or human resources, are being used. When we are at our full employment GDP, we will really only have some frictional or structural GDP, which we discussed earlier, which is the natural rate of unemployment. So the natural rate of unemployment is the concept that there is not a recession occurring and that we don't have any unnecessarily unemployed human capital resources. So I would say that when we're talking about the potential GDP or full employment GDP, we're talking about the same thing. We're talking about no one being unemployed beyond people who have quit their job to look for another job, those that are frictionally unemployed. And we're producing everything that we can possibly produce most efficiently with all labor, physical capital, technology, land, raw materials, and technology at our disposal. So now let's flip to aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is the relationship between the total quantity of goods and services demanded in the economy by all of the consumers in the economy and the price level for output. So as prices rise, consumers demand less and less of all goods and services. As prices fall, consumers demand more and more of goods and services. The aggregate demand equation is as follows. It is our consumption, business investment, government expenditures, and net exports. So the components of aggregate demand are our real GDP formula. So the next thing to think about, especially as you study and prepare for your exam, is we looked in micro at why demand and why supply shift. So why would aggregate supply or why would aggregate demand shift? And I have a depiction of the curve here. So aggregate supply will have this sort of flat section where as we move aggregate demand along our stationary aggregate supply curve, we won't really at low levels of real GDP be seeing too much of an increase in prices as we increase aggregate demand. We'll just be seeing an increase in real GDP. In this section of the curve, which is called the intermediate section of the curve, here to the left, the Keynesian section of the curve, when we increase aggregate demand or decrease aggregate demand, we will see an impact on prices. So increases in aggregate demand would lead to both an increase in real GDP and an increase in the price level. And in this sort of horizontal or vertical section of the curve, when we increase aggregate demand, we're not really seeing much of an increase in real GDP at all. We're actually just seeing an increase in the price level. We would call this the Keynesian section of the aggregate supply curve. And where the aggregate supply curve is vertical actually represents our full employment or potential GDP. And what that's saying is that with the available land, labor, capital, technology that we have today, so ceteris paribus, how much can we produce? So if there is no unemployment and all resources are being used efficiently, then we will produce along this purple curve, which would be our full employment GDP level, and it would be represented by an amount here. We're not using numbers, but it's just the concept that in this time period, we cannot increase our production unless we change the total land, labor, capital, and technology that we have access to. Okay, so why does this aggregate demand curve shift? Why would our aggregate supply curve shift? Couldn't our potential GDP change in the long run? So our aggregate supply is going to shift whenever we have changes in input prices to the production process. And these would be the kinds of input prices that affect widespread production. So it wouldn't just be the price of electronic components going into computers, because that wouldn't affect every single industry. It would be large, wide-scale input items such as energy prices. Is the price of gasoline or electricity production increasing or decreasing? That will affect every industry within the entire economy. Is the price of labor changing? Do we have increases or decreases in minimum wage? Do we just have general increases in wages for one reason or another? This will affect every single firm in an economy. And if a large component of our input goods are actually imported from foreign countries into most goods and services in a certain economy, then if the cost of those imported input goods changes, this can have an effect on the aggregate supply. So let's look at a hypothetical example. What would happen if, for example, energy prices dramatically increased overnight? So the price of gas went from $3 to $6 a gallon. This would shift our aggregate supply inward and to the left. When our aggregate supply curve shifts inward and to the left, the amount of real GDP that would be produced in equilibrium, if we're assuming that aggregate demand is not going to change here, would be much lower than it previously was, as represented by this new red line. If, for example, aggregate supply decreased substantially, or aggregate supply increased substantially because gas prices went from $6 back down to $3, we would see aggregate supply shift back. Again, our potential GDP would dramatically change. So our potential GDP would now become this amount versus what it previously was when energy prices were much lower. And that is because energy is, or gasoline in this example, is a huge component of the production of all goods and services. Now, let's take a look at aggregate demand. Aggregate demand shifters are any component of the aggregate production function. So if consumption, investment, government expenditures, or net exports change on their own, then we can expect to see a change in our aggregate demand, and our aggregate demand curve will shift. If we just see a change in price, we're just going to see movements along these curves. But if we see a change in any of the components of our real GDP expenditures model, consumption, investment, government spending, or net exports, then we can expect to see a shift in aggregate demand. So one example might be consumer confidence. So say consumer confidence increases and people begin to spend more and more. We might see that the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right because there will be more demand. If the aggregate demand curve shifts, we're going to have a higher level of GDP produced at higher prices. Previously, we were only producing, I'll do a little bit of curve movement for you. So previously, we would have been producing a quantity at a price level as demonstrated by this kind of red squiggly line. However, if consumer confidence increases and consumer spending picks up dramatically, our aggregate demand will get much closer, perhaps actually reach our full employment GDP, and we will be producing the total amount of real GDP, the maximum amount of real GDP that can be produced, where any more increases in aggregate demand will just lead to increases in prices. If consumer confidence falls, our consumption will be at a lower price level. The total amount of GDP produced will be at a lower price level and less real GDP will be produced. If the government decides to change its spending habits, we can also assume that there will be changes to aggregate demand. So increases in government spending will increase our aggregate demand. Decreases in government spending will decrease our aggregate demand, decreasing the price level and amount of real GDP produced. Tax cuts are also a really big part of this. If there are tax cuts, which mean that consumers have more disposable income, and there is no change to government spending, we would see that consumption would increase. This would lead to higher price levels and more real GDP produced. Potentially, if there was enough of a tax cut leading to enough real disposable income being available for consumption, we might actually be able to reach full employment real GDP. Right here, the difference between where we were and where we ended up due to that tax cut is actually called the GDP gap. This gap represents the difference between the amount of GDP that could be produced and the amount that is going to be produced. So this in here, this GDP gap, is sort of our shortfall in production, and it represents that there exists some unemployment, some cyclical unemployment, and potentially a small recession in the economy, depending how large of a difference we have between these two figures. If we have a tax cut and we do not have a change in government spending, we'd see an even bigger increase in our aggregate demand because the component of government spending has not changed. So this is just kind of a short reviewer of the chapter. I would make sure to read through all of this. As we move into these models for aggregate supply and demand, and we look at Keynesian and neoclassical perspectives on these curves, we're really getting into some serious material here in macroeconomics, which will be on the exam and which really is the heart of what we're trying to do. We're trying to see if we're in a recession or if we have inflation, is it possible that we can get out of these situations on our own? Will, as Say's law predict, as the neoclassical economists believe, will the issues right themselves? Will we come out of this recession on our own, or will inflation be curbed on its own because supply creates its own demand? Or, as Keynes predicts, will we need the government to intervene? Will the government have to have tax cuts where they increase disposable income available to consumers, which allows for more consumption, which shifts aggregate demand when we're in a recession? We don't have all of the tools to make that decision right now, but we're building with our models of aggregate supply and demand in order to understand the Keynesian and the neoclassical perspective in future chapters. So please contact me if you have any questions about this video. Next week we do not have class or any class material. I shouldn't say class because we don't meet together, but we won't have class material such as quizzes and discussion forums do. So thank you very much for watching the video, and I wish you all a wonderful spring.